Okay, with the last few people settling in, thank you very much for that. I guess we can get this meeting started. Hello, my name is Camilla Chlebna. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Kiel University in Germany. My own research sits at the intersections of economic geography, innovation research, and transition studies. This webinar today is part of the City and Regional Sustainability Transitions webinar series, CREST we call it, and that's about bringing together researchers from a range of career stages to showcase their work. Today is the first of two very special webinars where we actually collaborate with the TRAKR network. TRAKR stands for Transformative Knowledge Regions, and this has been recently funded by the RSA. Hugues Jeannerat is here from the TRAKR network and will introduce it in a moment. But before we begin this, I would just like to say a few words about our great host today, the RSA. The Regional Studies Association is a global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development, and policy. The RSA does support its members with the latest research, funding schemes, networking and publishing opportunities, and also spaces to grow research and careers. The RSA does host several webinars to support its members and also the wider community. For example, the Professional Development Webinar Series, or also the RSA International Hour, which showcases work from our international sections and divisions. You can find the recordings of those in the RSA Lounge online. Also, the annual conference of the RSA takes place this year in Florence in Italy from the 11th to the 14th of June. And we're really looking forward to seeing everyone there. The RSA web page currently accepts the abstracts for that. You have just over a week to secure your early bird rates. And I would also warmly recommend you to download the RSA app, which is called the RSA Hub, which will be helpful with the networking and also your session schedule for the RSA annual conference. At this point, I would very much like to invite Hugues Jeannerat from Neuchâtel University to briefly introduce the TRAKR network to you. Hugues, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Camilla, for your nice introduction and for giving us the opportunity to join forces with the City and Regional Sustainability Network webinar series, CREST. So I am Hugues Jeannerat. I'm professor at the University of Neuchâtel and a co-organizer of this RSA research network on transformative knowledge regions with Pauline Lavanchy, who might wave, also from the University of Neuchâtel, Anna Butzin and Kerstin Meyer from the Westphalian University of Applied Sciences, Jesper Manisch from the Center for Regional and Tourism Research on Bornholm, and Luis Carballo from the University of Porto. So our research network was launched in 2023 to explore the role of knowledge as an asset in regional development in light of the ongoing sustainability transition. You can find more information of this network on previous events on the RSA webpage and through the link that will be displayed in this chat of the webinar. After this first special session that we had in Ljubljana at the RSA annual conference, we had the first conceptual workshop in Gelsenkirchen last year. We are now very happy to propose two webinars on methods. Today's webinar will highlight epistemological and methodological issues for qualitatively exploring how transformative knowledge and knowledge dynamics develop and anchor in different regional contexts. The second webinar will take place on the 21st of March, next month, also at 12 o'clock, and we'll discuss how to quantify the potential transformative knowledge assets of regions and nations and the patterns and structures of transformation across time and space. We look really forward to welcoming you to this second webinar as well. Finally, I would also like to advertise our next offline workshop to meet you in place that will take place on the fabulous island of Bornholm. It will be organized by our colleague Jesper on the 3rd and 4th of October this year. This second workshop will be the opportunity to discuss empirical cases and publication issues for our research network. So Jesper will have some longer words about this at the end of the second part of this webinar. Please save the date and if you wish to join us. I will not speak much longer now. It is now time for our wonderful guest speaker that will be presented by Camilla, whom I would like really to thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I'm really looking forward to their keynote presentation and the ensuing discussion in the second part of the webinar, which I will have the pleasure to moderate with my colleague Anna, Kirsten, and Luis. Thank you all for your attending.
All right, thank you very much, Hugues, for this introduction of TRAKR and also just roughly introducing you to today's structure. So the first part will be basically quite normal CREST webinar, but with 3 talks. So you have the opportunity to ask questions. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box because I can pick them up from there much easier than from the chat. And the second part will then be a kind of workshop format where you can choose breakout rooms and talk to the keynote speakers and have a discussion, and that will then be summarized. And I believe there will be one big video created by the fabulous Alex Holmes afterwards of today's session. So as I say, just a few notes and general information. The webinar is being recorded and it will be made available to the members on the RSA Lounge. If you do not want to be in the picture, please switch off your videos. And also during the talks, please do switch off, please mute yourself so we don't hear you in the videos. And yeah, switch off your camera during the talks. If you do use social media, please do post about today's meetings, but please use the hashtag RSA webinar when you do so we can find your posts. So with that, it is high time to introduce our first speaker today. Our first speaker today is Gesa Pflitsch from the University of the Natural Resources and Life Sciences, also known as BOKU, in Vienna, in Austria. Gesa has received her PhD from the University of Marburg in Germany and later worked as an associate professor at Western Norway University of Applied Sciences in Bergen. Gesa is particularly interested in sustainability transformations at the urban and regional level. In her work, she combines approaches from evolutionary economic geography, neo-institutional theory, and sustainability transitions research. Among others, she conducts research on the role of universities and civil society actors in regional sustainability transformations and works on new methodological approaches to visually analyze regional transformation processes. Gesa, I'm very pleased to say the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, Camilla. I will first share my screen now. Yeah, I hope you can see it now. Yeah, and then I want to thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be part of this workshop today and to get the opportunity to talk about the visual analysis of complex process dynamics in transformative knowledge regions. And when mentioning visuals and transitions, this image probably comes to your mind. I think it's fair to say that this visual of the multi-level perspective has significantly shaped our thinking and our research about transformation processes. Yet such a prominent visualization can also lead to a cognitive bias, meaning that it can lead us to emphasize certain aspects of the phenomenon under study while ignoring others. And I think this trade-off becomes particularly problematic when you start shifting the focus of analysis from sectoral to regional systems, as this visual does not really capture essentially regional processes of transformation. Therefore, today I want to talk about visualizations, and I want to reflect a bit on some visual methods that might help us to map, analyze, and theorize the complex dynamics driving regional transformations. So I have 3 things on my agenda today. First, I will take a closer look at the transformative knowledge regions to get an idea of the criteria such methods need to fulfill. In the second part, I will then use the transition topology as an example to reflect on 3 visual methods, namely visual mapping, analyzing, and theorizing. And I will then conclude with some insights on what I think we might gain by working with such process-based visual approaches. And to elaborate on the characteristics of transformative knowledge regions, I will start with some examples of my own research in the Augsburg region. Here you can see some current examples from Augsburg that make apparent the diversity of transformation activities at the regional level. On the top, we have, for example, the Plastikfreie Schule, which is an activity which is about making schools plastic-free. And then another one, the Dialograum Geld, which is about fundamentally questioning existing financial practices. Below, we have the Grand Hotel, which brings together hotel guests, local artists, and refugees to experiment with new forms of community. And then we also have the utopian housing lab, Wolkenkuckucksheim, in which people develop visions for future housing in Augsburg. So as you can see, these activities are quite dispersed across a wide range of thematic fields, such as finance and housing, or they are per se cross-sectoral in nature, such as the Grand Hotel or the plastic-free schools. And the complexity further increases when you look at these activities from a temporal perspective. First, these activities started at different points in time, as you can see here. And second, these activities sometimes also change themselves over time. For example, the Grand Hotel is now also offering spaces for local activists and NGOs, as well as temporary housing for people in need. And third, these activities also coincided with different institutional changes, like the establishment of a sustainability advisory board to the city council, or the development of a future vision for Augsburg, which integrates different sustainability dimensions. So what you see here is that this process is quite complex, consisting of a broad range of activities that change over time, as does the context in which these activities are embedded. And this makes it very difficult to empirically capture these processes. Now, before I come to a discussion of the methods which could be suitable to analyze such processes, I want to take a step back and reflect a bit on the ontological perspectives from which we are looking at such processes. When it comes to temporal phenomena, researchers in our field usually draw on one of 2 ontological perspectives. One is a variance-based ontology, which focuses on detecting causal relations between variables. So an example here would be if we wanted to investigate if and how the foundation of the local agenda in Augsburg caused the transformation process there. And then we have a process ontology, which instead focuses on emergent, evolving, or disappearing phenomena over time. This is often adopted in research based on the MLP, regional development paths, or I think also in the research on knowledge trajectories. And while a variance-based ontology is suitable to detect causality, a process ontology, as these visuals here also suggest, is more suitable, I think, to analyze in depth the complex processes driving regional transformations. Yet it's worthwhile to dig a bit deeper into different forms of process ontologies. Cloutier and Langley differentiate between weak and strong process ontologies, where a weak process ontology that you see here views processes as happening to things. So as you can see here, the focus is rather on the letters, which display concrete entities such as actors or organizations or even systems. A strong process ontology, on the other hand, sees these entities instead as momentary instantiation of processes. So here the focus lies not on the entities themselves, but rather on the underlying processes. Empirical research in our field, in my experience, often applies a rather weak process ontology, which is oriented along definable things, such as predefined categories like niches and regimes, and which is interested mainly in how these things change over time. In contrast, a strong process ontology would be open to the investigation of emergent processes and phenomena, which makes capturing these processes methodologically, of course, quite challenging. Therefore, I want to have a closer look at the methods now that I think might be suitable to capture complex process dynamics driving regional transitions. And Eng Langley, who is a renowned researcher working on process-based approaches in the field of organization studies, argues that especially visual methods have the qualities that are necessary for applying the process ontology. And she explains this by saying that visualizations, and now I quote Langley, allow the simultaneous representation of a large number of dimensions, and they can easily be used to show precedents, parallel processes, and the passage of time. Langley also refers in her work to three visual methods, namely visual mapping, analysis, and theorizing. And in the following, I want to show you how I think a combination of these methods allows us to exploit the full potential of a process ontology. Therefore, I will now use the approach of the transition topology that I developed together with Simone Strambach as an example. And in line with neo-institutionalist theory, the transition topology that you see here now maps organizational changes as proxies for ongoing processes of institutional change. And I will now use mainly the transition topology of the Augsburg region to illustrate the three visual methods, starting with the visual mapping of process data. So mapping can be understood as the visual organization of the empirical material. So it's basically a way of visual coding, which is, however, still rather descriptive and close to the original material. And process data usually consists of two different elements, namely events and activities. Events constitute occurrences and happenings, marking moments of change, while activities are referring to the social actions and practices that lead to these events. And how events and activities are represented in a map usually already shows us if it's based on a weak or a strong process ontology. Often in a weak process ontology, you find a visual map that focuses primarily on the events. I try to illustrate this here with the example of Augsburg, where I mapped, based on interview data, some milestone events on a timeline, for example, the foundation of the local agenda process and the establishment of a sustainability advisory board. But as you can already see, such a timeline is insufficient in order to capture more complex processes. So to make the step now towards a strong process ontology means that we also have to incorporate the activities that connect these milestone events. In the Augsburg example, these activities are displayed by the arrows now. And you might also notice that the graph now also contains two additional events that were not named as milestones, but which were still important for these milestones to happen. So what you can see here is that how shifting from a weak to a strong process ontology already leads us to generate other visual maps. Of course, this example is only an extract from a much more comprehensive mapping exercise, as you can see here. There are, of course, many activities and events happening outside or in parallel to those that I just described. And although this can always look a bit messy, this mapping is already useful, I think, for what Langley described, that is, for making apparent precedents, parallel processes, and how processes evolve over time. After the mapping, the next visual method is the visual analysis of the data, which is crucial to make sense of complex visual maps. Visual analysis, according to Anne Langley and David Ravasi, means two things. It means reducing complexity and identifying patterns. Reducing complexity is achieved by working out essential features in the map by categorizing the data. And this categorization can be done in a more inductive or more deductive way. But either way, the aim is here to reduce an infinite number of events into a definite and smaller number of categories. And again, you can see in the transition topology, Simone and I identified events primarily in form of different forms of organizational changes. Because in contrast to institutional changes, organizational changes have the advantage that they can be located clearly in time and space. You can also see that we differentiated here primarily between new, more permanent organizations, networks, and temporary organizations, because we expected them, based on theory, to affect institutional change differently. Activities here in the topology refer mainly to embedded agency of organizations or of actors in these organizations, such as lobbying or legitimizing or other forms of institutional work. And this abstraction now allows us to proceed with another form of visual analysis, namely the identification of patterns. Patterns can be instances or actions that either repeat themselves in the material or which we already know from other cases. Lange and Ravasi also suggest three heuristics for identifying patterns visually, namely aggregation, comparison, and decomposition of maps. And in view of time, I will focus today on one of these heuristics, namely decomposition, and I will use the Augsburg example to illustrate now how it can be applied. So here you see the comprehensive topology for the Augsburg region with a timeline running from bottom to top. You see that the topology depicts these different forms of organizational change and also some proxies for institutional changes here in yellow. And without going into detail here, you can see that the civil society-driven local agenda process in Augsburg was one of the key drivers of the transformation process, because it initiated a substantial amount of further institutional and organizational changes. However, I knew from the interview partners that the local agenda had been in a very peripheral position in the early stages of the process. So the question for me was, how could such a peripheral actor generate such a strong dynamic in the regional path? And to analyze this, I decomposed the map into three different maps, each of which is shaped by different events and activities. In the first phase, the local agenda emerged as a hybrid actor. You see here that organizations from different fields, the public field and from civil society, were involved in the formation of the local agenda. So the underlying process dynamic here is one of convergence, which could also be depicted in form of such a more generic pattern. In the second phase, the first local agenda forums were formed, as you can see here, and these new temporary organizations emerged in parallel or within a very short time span out of the local agenda. So this can be described as a proliferation of organizational changes. So you can see that this phase is shaped by a fundamentally different pattern than the first phase. And then in the third phase, we see two combined processes. The first was the formation of a second generation of forums, and the second was one of institutional changes that were caused by these forums, and then again also initiated further temporary organizational changes. So this pattern basically describes the alternation between organizational and institutional changes. So coming back to the question now how the local agenda could create such a strong dynamic in the past, the decomposition showed that these three different sub-processes had to add up over time, namely convergence, proliferation, and the stabilization of change. So what I wanted to show with this example is how visual analysis can help us to structure and make sense of dense, complex process data. But how do such visual analysis now also enables us to generate and visualize new theoretical insights? The main idea of theorizing by visualizing is that we replace the empirical elements now with more generic and conceptual elements that can also be transferred to other cases. And this requires detaching the findings from the data by elaborating again on the theoretical mechanism behind these patterns. So in our case, the theoretical foundation was neo-institutionist theory, and using this theory, we could now say that the convergence pattern describes the combination of different institutional logics into one hybrid organization, which then often induces a dynamic of institutional change. Here's another example of a visual theorizing, also from the Augsburg case, in which the distance between theory and empirical data is now further increased. This figure abstracts from the visual patterns that we saw in the previous slides by highlighting three central processes, namely exploring, bridging, and focusing, which are based on these patterns that we just saw. And what makes this a process ontological theorization is that there is no optimal, generally valid balance here between these three processes, but instead, as displayed here, in different phases, different processes were crucial for the regional transformation process. So to wrap this up, I want to discuss shortly what we might gain when working with such process-based visual methodologies. And to do this, I would first like to recap again how visual methods, such as the transition topology, differ from visual concepts like the MLP. In the MLP that you see here, visual theorizing takes place through the combination of different existing theories. So the MLP is an example of building visual theory without a direct connection to the empirical data. This figure now on the right describes the combination of visual methods from mapping to theorizing that I just described at the example of the transition topology. And what results from this are different layers of visualization, which create what you could call a deep visualization. And such deep visualizations are, as you can see here, more grounded in the empirical material, which enables them to capture also emergent phenomena outside of predefined categories. And I would like to end with the typical saying among geographers that the map is not the territory, in order to point out some challenges and also potentials of visual theorizing. And I think certainly prominent visualizations of the MLP, but also of regional innovation systems or clusters have proven to be very helpful boundary spanners to policymakers. Yet this often goes along, and I'm quoting Kevin Morgan here, with the tendency to collapse levels of abstraction into simple narratives to render them digestible for these actors. And I think deep visualizations, by enabling alternations between different levels of abstraction, might be a way to deal with this challenge, and they might also be a way to develop a deeper understanding of regional transformations. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't take too much time.
Excellent timing, Gesa.
Right.
Maybe we can, or maybe you want to keep your screen shared in actual fact.
Yeah.
I have to apologize to everyone. I talked of a Q&A box that doesn't exist. That is basically because I'm so used to our usual CREST webinars where we do have a Q&A box. So I was just in that, and actually here we don't have a Q&A box. So if you do have questions, please do put them in the chat this time. And actually I can see we do have some questions already here. And I think I might link some of that to some questions of my own I have. So we have here from Michael Boyle, what components did you consider in establishing the notational framework chosen? I would link that to my own question, like how did you go about the data collection for this? And I guess that is also the question that underlies here, like what framework did you have in your mind before you went into data collection?
Yes, so this is more about the theoretical framework that I had in mind in order to collect my data, or
that's my understanding of the question, yeah.
Okay, okay. Okay,
what were the elements of the framework?
Okay. Yeah, so in my case, I mean, maybe I can use a transition topology as an example, because the development of this visual method kind of started with the fact that I wanted to analyze a regional transformation process in the Augsburg region. And I found it very difficult with the MLP or the other existing frameworks in economic geography to capture such a process, because it didn't really fit into these predefined categories. So I searched for different approaches, and in this case, I ended up with some more, I would say, generic theoretical approaches, such as neo-institutional theory, but also the past development, the literature on past development from evolutionary economic geography, in order to define the basic mechanisms that such a process builds on. But I didn't go in with predefined categories. That's why I developed this approach of transition topology, this process-based approach, because I wanted to really also capture more emergent phenomena. So that's kind of the idea behind it. But there was, of course, it wasn't completely grounded in the way grounded theory goes in without any theoretical, previous theoretical knowledge, so to say.
Okay, I understand. There's basically 3 more questions, and they're all around kind of more detailed nitty-gritty of how did you go about it. I will draw them together into basically one long question, but I ask you for a more or less relatively short answer. Also, maybe you could already stop sharing your screen. That will also make it then easier to move over to our next speaker. So why is to do that? How concretely did you distinguish networks, organizations, and institutions when you went out about your analysis? And kind of linked to that, why did you choose a flowchart description or depiction for components which are commonly also non-linear elements? And very similar, I would say, question from Flora, actually, how do you identify which events and activities to include in your mapping and which not, and what happens with more intangible things? And Hugues will have to wait.
Okay, I think that's quite a lot. Maybe we can also take this to the breakout rooms later.
Maybe just a brief.
Maybe just a brief. I mean, maybe I just have Flora's question in mind. I think about how do you select the elements that go into the map? I mean, in the first step, in my case, it was about the interview that I did, where I asked the actors from different fields, what were the most important events. I did that in parallel to document analysis, and the document analysis was really good for finding out about details that actors didn't remember, but of course the interviews were important to depict the most important milestone events. But then in the next step, it's of course also the categorization based on the theoretical approach, which then also links to this next question, which decide what actually ends up in the map and what I maybe need to kick out or describe in a more narrative part of the paper also.
Okay, and I can see there's plenty of potential for more questions and lots of detail and also interest in the exact method and how do you go about it. But I think that's all very good material for the later workshop discussion. So with that, I think we will move on to our next speaker. Christian Binz, I'm very, very glad to welcome you here for this session. Christian Binz works at the Department of Environmental Social Sciences at the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology, Eawag to the rest of us, in Zurich in Switzerland. Christian is a research group leader. His main research interests are centered on the geographies of innovation and sustainability transitions, the globalization of clean tech innovation, as well as green industrial path development and leapfrogging dynamics in middle-income countries such as China and India. By combining recent insights from transition studies, economic geography, and institutional sociology, he aims to explore how multiscalar actor networks and institutional arrangements influence the development and diffusion of clean tech industries and sustainability transitions in key infrastructure sectors such as energy, water, or transport. With that, I'm very glad to say, Christian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Camilla, for the introduction, and welcome also from my side. I think that I will sort of complement what Gesa has presented just before in a quite interesting way. So yeah, really looking forward to discussion also later on the overlaps here. So basically, I will present my ideas on how we could trace transformative knowledge dynamics with this new method we're currently developing at our research institute, together with colleagues, which we call socio-technical configuration analysis. And I'm gonna basically move through 4 main parts in my presentation. First, also talk quickly about the challenge of tracing these transformative knowledge dynamics. Then give a very short primer of the method and how it works. And then I will give some empirical illustration of what you can trace with this method, and then reflect a bit on what it means for transformative knowledge regions and also what might be possible in the future that we haven't tackled yet in our work. So to start, I copy-pasted this very nice slide from Anna and colleagues, which I presented at last year's RSA annual conference, which is basically outlining the new paradigm that we're entering in sort of when talking about regional, thinking about regional development. So I think that it's across economic geography, regional studies, innovation, and also transition studies, we see that the goal of innovation and that we want to reach is shifting quite strongly recently, and that we're moving away from this old paradigm, which was about product and process innovation that you can create with sort of knowledge-intensive processes and that create growth and prosperity, like economic growth and prosperity in regions, to this new paradigm, which is more about creating socio-technical configurations that really work, and then creating inclusive human well-being. So in a way, the goal of innovation is really shifting quite dramatically, and this has a lot of implications how we conceptualize and also the methods we use to think about how these transformations come about. So what we need is target systems and transformative knowledge for how we can induce deep sectoral and regional transformations, in essence. And also drawing on neo-institutional sociology like Gesa, we've created sort of our own visualization of how transitions could come about, which also differs from the MLP in quite strong ways. Essentially, in our work, we're saying, okay, transitions are about the deinstitutionalization of existing unsustainable socio-technical configurations and the gradual institutionalization of new socio-technical configurations that differ, in the technologies they use, the key values they represent, but also sort of the key guiding sort of field logic that sort of pulls these different elements together. So you could think about transition in energy, like there was a long time a dominant regime which had certain technologies, fossil fuel-based energy, certain values, regulations, standards that came with these technologies, certain actors pushing for them. And there was this sort of more transformational sort of alternative configurations that were not deeply institutionalized at the beginning, having a very different logic, which is more about sustainability than competitiveness or efficiency, that gradually sort of became more institutionalized and sort of the core logic in this energy field. So transformative knowledge, in this conceptualization is about knowledge that enables, to induce changes in these deeply entrenched system structures and institutionalization of a very new basic field logic. Now, there's different ways in which you could trace these dynamics. And there's, of course, 3 generic approaches we could use. Well, basically, this is a very complex problem to trace these transformations because we deal with multidimensional, relational, sort of configurational problems, many different elements that have to work together to make a transformation happen. And these are long-term and dynamic processes. So it's really about process rather than sort of variance explanations. And the first, method to use is, of course, qualitative methods, really deep contextual or case studies, which actually have been used a lot in transition studies in the past. So we've had a lot of historical narratives, in-depth case studies, expert interview campaigns, and so on and so on. And these methods have the, of course, advantage that you have this deep contextual embedding. You have high control of interpretation of what you see in a way as a researcher, but it's also really hard to sort of create comparative analysis between regions and sectors to induce more cumulative theory building. That's been a notorious challenge here. We could also go for quantitative methods on the other hand, but this, Gesa has laid out very quickly. Then if we use these methods, we're locked into this variance type of explanations, which are really good at creating or sort of finding generalizable sort of patterns and induce sort of cumulative theory building, but they're really limited in tackling these more complex and configurational sort of causal relations. And so then, the middle ground is actually to use sort of semi-quantitative approaches which stand between these 2 sort of traditions and which, in my case, use large textual databases. So the method we're proposing, STCA, is really a novel approach in this middle ground, which is actually gaining a lot of traction recently across different fields. So what's the essence of the method? It's basically the idea to use large textual document stocks. So this could be newspaper repositories, project reports, social media. It could be policy documents that you use as a basis for your analysis. Then you basically use qualitative coding to sort of identify the statements a different actor or actor types make about certain solutions that are up and coming in a field. So you aggregate these statements into network representations, and then you can use these network visualizations in a way to analyze how socio-technical configurations evolve over time and space. To explain this in a bit more detail, basically what we have, in these documents, we find different actors on the one hand side that voice their opinion about certain solutions. So about, for example, conventional energy solutions versus renewables. And we can now trace, if 2 actors voice the same opinion about a certain solution, like fossil fuel-based energy, in public media, for example, then this creates a connection between these 2 actors. So they share the same view of what the best solution for a given problem is. And you can aggregate this over the whole network, and you can identify the sort of actor coalitions that push for a given regime solution or a very transformative alternative solution. And often what's more interesting, we can do the same thing on the concept network level. So if one actor sort of frames a certain technology together with a certain value, for example, then this creates a link between these 2 concepts. And if you, again, aggregate this across the network, then you get like a concept network, which then you can interpret as socio-technical configurations, sort of coherent combinations of technologies, values, norms, standards, that together form a coherent sort of, whole in a field. So the basic intuition is then that we can represent shifts in the social technical configurations in the region and sector through these actor and concept networks. And we have actually created a lot of sort of also background materials. There's a guidebook, an online guidebook that would explain in much more detail how you could go through this sort of analysis in a step-by-step, very hands-on manner. Okay, so basically we have this 4-step approach. First, you select and construct a suitable database. Then you do the qualitative coding of these actor statements. You can also code key events. That's also totally possible. Then you construct these sort of adjacency matrices between actors and concepts. And then you visualize, analyze, and interpret the results. So what we usually get is these radar plots, where we can, basically see in the middle of the plot the concepts that are most deeply taken for granted, that are used by a lot of actors and framed coherently with other sort of concepts. So here this could be, for example, that there's a core field logic, again, in the energy sector, that's about efficiency, And that's related to coal-fired power plants and nuclear technology, for example. And there's certain values and standards that also then are often sort of framed together in a very coherent, stable configuration. And there might be more transformative configurations that are less deeply institutionalized, less taken for granted, more at the fringes of this plot, which then you can trace how they develop over time and start to challenge the incumbent regime and eventually hybridize it or even overthrow it. So that's the basic intuition we have developed here, and I can now use this to give you actually some examples of what you can do with this. And it's all going to be based on examples from this transition in the urban water management field, which is a really interesting sector that's actually under a lot of pressure to transform recently, which has a very monolithic regime. Basically, the standard solution to solve water and sanitation problems is to build very large-scale centralized infrastructures. So they're very capital intensive, very inflexible. They have really strong problems in adapting to climate change, rapid urbanization. So there's a lot of pressure to transform how this is done. So the new logic that's emerging in this sector is about decentralized, circular, sort of modular water solutions. So actually having solutions that reuse water, energy, nutrients in small-scale systems within the toilet, in the shower, or maybe with a small treatment plant that you put in the basement of your building. So this is a very different logic than what we had in the past in the sector, and this is now emerging in different parts of the world, and we can trace in different regions particularly, we can trace how these transformations come about or not through STCA. So I want to give you 3 empirical illustrations what you can do with this. The first one is that we can map regions embedding in a sort of more multi-scalar opportunity space for a transition to happen. So this example is from a study by Jonas Heiberg in his PhD, where we basically took global newspaper articles that were tackling sort of water-related issues. And then we mapped how the legitimacy of these transformative innovations, how that differs in different parts of the world. And we could really see that there's a strong sort of spatial variation here. So there's some places, especially some regions in India, where actually the discourse is really favorable for actually these transformative, very new solutions. There's other places like Singapore, which is really locked into the old regime sort of solutions. And then there's these intermediary cases like the USA, where it's then really interesting to look into the dynamics and what happened over time. So this is a representation of these radar plots for the United States. What you see in the sort of the first phase of our analysis is that these conventional regime sort of solutions were really taken for granted, strongly institutionalized in the discourse. And these alternatives are really a really sort of peripheral discussion in the sector at the beginning. In the second phase, a drought hits, especially the western sort of states of the USA. And suddenly in the discourse, we see that these alternatives are now framed as centrally as the conventional solution. So there's a strong framing struggle going on between proponents of both solutions. And in the last phase, and especially in California and specific regions of California, we see that now the discourse is really dominated by these alternative solutions. So you see really a structural sort of transformation in the discourse, in this case, in media, about what the best solution for these sort of strong water problems are. So you could say we have some indications or proxy indication that, you know, the structural sort of preconditions have really improved for transforming in this direction in different parts of the USA. You can also trace the multiscalarity of these issues. So this basically map shows that, you know, who actually voices their opinions about what the best solutions are is not only local sort of actors in a given place. So when we looked into South Africa, for example, Cape Town, we found, which had a really strong drought and a really big problem in our analysis frame, that most actors that voice what Cape Town should do is actually international actors. So it's like donors, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, it's multinational companies, it's engineering consultants from other parts of the world. So the way what's happening in the region, what looks legitimate, is very strongly influenced from actually outside actors. We can also see that this global discourse for the best solution is strongly influenced by US actors that are really active also in framing these sort of more global expert discourses in this sector. So, you know, with this sort of analysis, we can see that the potential for regional transformations is really influenced by these multiscalar dynamics. And, you know, tracing the opportunity spaces for a transition to happen in a region in this more multi-scalar way will be a key form of transformative knowledge, that local actors, they could actually draw on this by inviting external actors that sort of support their transformative agenda, or by locking the actors out that will sort of jeopardize their transformative ideas. Okay, second example is we can trace competing logics and also conflicts in transition trajectories. And that's an example from my colleagues, again, Jonas Heiberg and Bernhard Truffer, where they looked into an emerging innovation system for these alternative water solutions in Switzerland, in different Swiss regions. And they could use the same approach to basically trace 3 different sort of clusters of actors that follow a very different basic sort of value direction, which creates a lot of friction in this emerging innovation system in Switzerland. So what they basically found is that there's like one group of actors which is really much sort of pushing for social, ecological field logics, nature-based solutions, sort of low-tech, you know, innovation that allows these creates these circular water systems. So they're strongly having this sort of bottom-up, community-based, grassroots movement sort of logic in their activities. Then there's a second cluster of actors, which is more actually in research and development, a lot of engineers, basically really following an engineering professional logic, creating sort of high-tech, integrative, highly efficient solutions for water problems. And then there's a third one, which is actors that favor a sort of a market industry logic, which is really about creating mass manufactured modular water solution and selling them in global mass markets. So really having this sort of market-based ideology. And of course, these different actor networks, they conflict. There's a few of them that work together, but many of them actually don't really like each other's sort of way of creating innovation in this emerging field. And so this, in a way, of course, creates variety, but it also hampers the sort of creation of a joint agenda in pushing this transformation forward across the country and more internationally. I have to shorten here a bit. So basically, I think that these institutional complexities and frictions, they can really hinder transformative change from happening more quickly. And then how can you navigate this complexity, and how you can create new hybrid logics that would allow sort of a joint agenda? That's a key type of transformative knowledge that, you know, regions would have to build up. So the last example is about understanding actor strategies that might hinder transitions. And this is an example from a study in San Diego, which is a very interesting case because it actually, the city decided to go for desalination as the main solution for its water problems. And desalination is a very sort of regime-like, capital-intensive, inflexible solution for water problems. And there was indeed a lot of debate in the region on whether this is the best solution for the local drought problems, or whether there would be alternatives that would be more sustainable. And initially, this was a very heated debate. So when we traced this debate, in the first phase, we saw that the discourse was really separated between an anti-desalination coalition that was led by environmental NGOs mostly, a pro-desalination coalition that was led by a multinational company and some local governments, and then a pro-recycling coalition, which was basically also local cities that wanted to create large-scale centralized water use solutions, and a quite small coalition that was about, no, we have to transform into these more modular, small-scale circular systems. And when we move forward into the next phase, when this region was hit by a strong drought again, then we see that the discourse, the structure is really shifting to a new framing in which the key actors agree that we actually need a diversified local water portfolio. So this company, together with this key proponents of desalination, really skillfully adapted the discourse in a way that it now said, okay, in this emergency, whatever creates a new water source is good and has to be pushed. And that, of course, then put desalination back on the agenda and sort of push the whole discourse away from this very sort of controversial framing in the phase before. Combined with some lobbying behind the scenes, sort of networking, you know, then desalination came out as the winner out of this story. So, you know, understanding and anticipating these actor strategies, and also of actors, again, maybe from outside the region, and how they might influence or hinder transformation from happening, is then a third type of transformative knowledge that will be really important to create when you think about transformative knowledge regions. So just to sum it up with a few reflections, I think the insights that the STCA method can create is really, first of all, that we have a more systematic way of reconstructing these shifts in socio-technical configurations over time and space. It creates a more structured view on the interplay of technological innovation and social valuation in transitions. And it also allows for these more longitudinal process-focused explanations of how and where regional transformations come about. So in a way, I think it provides new types of systems and target knowledge that can then be very crucial in supporting transformative change. There's also a lot of limitations and challenges. So this is, as I said, it's very much work in progress. It's a very sort of new thing we're still trying to figure out ourselves. So one problem this has is that you have particular document stocks which give you a certain filter of what you see of reality. So if you take newspaper articles, you know, the editorial policies of the newspapers give you a certain filter of what you can represent. If you take policy documents, you have another filter. Social media has yet another filter ingrained in it. So you need to be very careful with how you would do the interpretation of your results. Often we don't see the regime actors very strongly in our documents, so they tend to keep silent unless there is a big crisis like a drought, and then suddenly they need to sort of voice what they think is the best solution for a given problem. And then it still relies on human coding quite a bit. So we still sort of do the coding of these documents in a manual way, which is very cumbersome, but it's also still really important. So we realized you cannot really automatize this yet. But there is, of course, a lot of development in this field. So there is one opportunity to use topic modeling, large language models, global textual databases to get to a more sort of standardized way of how you can run the method, hopefully. I think it has a big potential to also look into valuation dynamics, different spatial scales, as a complement to the innovation dynamics, knowledge dynamics we know a lot about already, and then to develop more systematic cross comparisons of transitions in different, you know, regions, sectors, countries, and so on. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Thanks a lot for your attention. I really look forward to discussing this in more depth with whoever is interested. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Christian. Hugely interesting method. Every time I see a presentation of yours, I understand a little bit more. So I think it's fair to say it's also a rather complex method. I see a kind of 3 groups of questions, I would say. So I just, I think, summarize them a little bit. And then for the further detail, I'd say I refer to... That always confuses me. I refer to the breakout sessions later. One is, how did you actually, this kind of nitty-gritty method, how did you choose and access the articles? How can you build a database from these online sources that you can actually analyze? How do you geolocate them? Can you give us a bit more detail? And I think you answered about coding, but maybe it's of interest what software you used for that process.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, so with the articles, it depends what you want to do. Sometimes when we do this global mapping, we use global databases like Nexus Uni, which has a lot of limitations, but still gives you a good enough sort of panel, you know, that you can work with. Now I'm working on a case study, for example, on salmon farming in Norway, and they really went into specific newspapers and really scanned them for all the articles that cover something on salmon farming. And then you can be very specific with what outlets you want, what editorial policies you want to include, how you make sure that all regions of the country are represented. So you can get very granular with the way you build these databases. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach, but it really depends on what your research question is. The geolocation, there's 2 ways. One is that you just say, okay, all the articles in one newspaper will be representing that region. And the other way, which we use more, is that we actually, in each statement made, we sort of have codes that geolocate what the code refers to. So where is the person that's speaking actually located? So what is the sort of reference region of the statement? And sometimes also what reference do they make to other places far away? So often you have these statements where people say, yeah, salmon farming in Chile is very unsustainable, but here in Norway it's more sustainable because, and then so you can also create all these connections between places that actors often make in their statements. So that's about that. In terms of software, we use NVivo in the past. Now we also use MaxQDA, and we hope that there will be some more open source packages at some point. There is one which doesn't work very well that political sciences often use. But in a way, it's a very simple, solution. So you basically just need a coding solution, and then one which allows you to make like cross-reference tables between different codes. So in a way, there's a lot of tools that could be used to do this. And then we use social network analysis tools. Some R is involved, but it's all very simple in a way, and you can find it in this guidebook. It's not a rocket science at all.
Right, I allow us a brief summary of basically the other questions here, which is kind of about how do you choose what becomes a concept, right? There's other things that could be of interest, like economic aspects, natural aspects, that are kind of seem to be somewhat outside of your framework, or could they also become part of could they become concepts that you are studying, or how do you actually go about choosing what is and is not studied in an STCA?
Yeah, this is a very good question. We're really struggling with this also a lot. We are thinking if we can standardize this to some degree. Essentially, concepts is like the basic elements of a social technical system, which relates to actor networks, institutions, and technologies or materiality in a way. But below these big labels, you can package a lot of stuff. And often now we have a sort of abductive way of defining that. So we have a basic conceptual idea, we create a coding tree, and then based on the data we get, this evolves a lot. So what are concepts, how to differentiate them, which concepts included in what study? It's not standardized yet, and that's a big task in the future to sort of make this maybe a bit more systematic, I would say. But I guess this is also really early stage, so we're also learning with each study how this can be done, and it's actually pretty versatile. We realize you can include a lot as a concept in your analysis.
Again, I think there's plenty of room for discussion for the breakout room later. Already very, very interesting questions. Hugues, I'm so sorry to do this again, but I will have to refer your question again to the later discussion. It maybe can be part of the reflections as well, I think. But I think we're already running on a slight delay, but I am very happy to now welcome our third speaker today, Flora Cornish. Flora Cornish is Associate Professor in Qualitative Research Methodology at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the United Kingdom. Flora is a community psychologist investigating the role of grassroots mobilization in improving public health, both through local level community responses to health crisis and through wider organizing, coalition building, and campaigning. She aims to do research that has transformative potential with an interest in democratizing knowledge, using qualitative methods, community collaborations, and theoretical resources that resonate with health promoting struggles. With that, very glad to say, Flora, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, I just had a panic about unmuting myself. Can you hear me okay? And you can see my screen? Great, yes. Thank you. Okay, thanks so much to the previous speakers and to Camilla for that lovely introduction. My talk is a little bit about research as transformative itself. So research processes and how they can contribute to transformation. So I think it's kind of like a slightly different approach to the previous talks, but I think very harmonious with them in a way. So I'm going to talk about engaged researchers and transformative knowledge. And when Hugues talked to me about this, setting, he said that the audience would be interested in thinking about the epistemological and methodological sort of underlying principles of qualitative research in this area. And so that's kind of what I'm going to talk to you about today. So, okay, so here I have a bit of an outline. I'll talk to you a little bit about an epistemology for engaged research. Then I'll talk about engaged research methods as a whole, looking at a kind of a different spectrum of different levels of researcher engagement using different kinds of methods. And then this leads on to thinking about, well, you know, if engaged research methods are like this and they introduce various challenges, how do we try to address those challenges? And I'll speak about something I'll call social infrastructures for collaboration, and then methodological practices for good engaged research. And I have a few questions at the end, which I hope people might find interesting to reflect upon, especially if you're doing some kind of research where the researcher is not in a sort of ivory tower on the left-hand side here, but rather is more engaged in the research environment. So kind of briefly on the epistemology that I'm bringing to bear here, this is really, I think, similar to the variable-based versus process-based epistemologies. I kind of contrast a maybe more traditional, typically more quantitative objectivist epistemology, exemplified with kind of the ivory tower here, that the researcher gathers objective information, digests it, and then when we're thinking about our relation to society, the dissemination is sort of, we distribute from upon high our insights for policymakers and practitioners to take up. And it just, you know, let's say long and short of it, I don't think it doesn't really work. So in contrast, I prefer this sort of gardening metaphor, getting our hands dirty, working together, producing some changes in collaboration together. And under this umbrella, I sort of think about and inspired a lot by a pragmatist epistemology, which you may be very familiar with, because I think it resonates a lot with what people have been talking about already. So the kind of pragmatism that I'm interested in, it originates with American pragmatist philosophers, Peirce, James Dewey, and Mead. And they really, Dewey, and then later Donald T. Campbell, really initiated a whole research program on experimentation. They didn't see experimentation in the way that a lot of economists have really sort of like colonized a whole lot of sort of work, I think, recently with fetishizing the randomized control trial. But they really saw experimentation as trying things out and exploring their impacts, and that society could improve itself by being in a more experimenting sort of a creative mode. And so in pragmatism, as you probably know, they take practical activity as the bedrock of knowledge. So arguing that we experience, test, and subscribe to ideas in practice. So it's against a kind of rationalistic idea of knowledge. And they say that knowledge can be tested by its consequences. And so epistemologically, one of the things that this approach does is it changes the question. If we have a representational theory of truth, it changes the question from, does this knowledge accurately reflect reality, to the question that Richard Rorty posed, does this knowledge serve our purposes? Or does it work in practice? And so this approach sort of, in a way, it destabilizes, you know, where are our foundations, but it says that our foundations are in practice. So it's not relativistic. We can test our ideas in practice and see if they work. And so I think it leads us to sort of three important principles that are very relevant to engaged methodology. The first one is about positionality, which you may be very familiar with. For the pragmatists, they assumed perspectivism. That is, that the knowledge that we have comes from a certain perspective that is embodied, socially positioned, has ideological assumptions, intellectual assumptions, and we can't get out of it. So let's just own it and reflect on it and, you know, think, how do we work with our positionality rather than try to erase them as in an objectivist approach? Then this also brings along a theme of relationality. So the idea here is that, okay, if we all have different perspectives, if we want to make social changes, it's going to take working together. It's going to take building relationships across different kinds of different kinds of chasms of interests, knowledge, power, structural position, institutional location, etc. And the last one is about knowledge in action, so that the way that we generate new knowledge is through trying to bring about changes in practice. So these three themes, I think, will sort of float across throughout my talk, and we'll see how they come about. I wanted to give you an example of my research to sort of show how, where I'm sort of coming from, and how some of these might look in practice. And it also illustrates sort of my ideas about transformative knowledge and how transformation happens. So this came from a piece of work I did in collaboration with emergency planners in the Falkland Islands. And we were interested in the idea of Arundhati Roy's idea. She proposed that we could use the pandemic as a portal. So the idea that all the disruption of the pandemic, as awful as it was, we had might create opportunities for transformation to bring about social orders that we would more prefer to have. And so one of the things that we did together there was to do some research, doing community impact assessments of the pandemic. The Falkland Islands is a self-governing British overseas territory, which is inhabited by around 65% are British, around 69% have permanent residency, and 31% have temporary residency. And there's a presence of visible minority migrant workers, but because the territory is very geopolitically hot and contested, questions of citizenship are very sort of difficult to address, and the presence of minorities is quite sort of hidden. So in doing these community impact assessments, we kind of wanted to look at how are the lockdowns, how have they been affecting different groups differently? And we worked together to try to make visible some of the structural inequalities that hadn't been visible before. We wanted to make these community impact assessments inclusive and effective, and so we did that by enrolling the political will of a lot of stakeholders and by recruiting research participants in a more inclusive and energetic way than they had done previously. So they often did sort of surveys before to gather people's opinions, online surveys, but not everybody accessed those. So we worked together to come up with quite a lot more intensive process that involved meetings in community groups, one-to-one interviews where necessary, and so on, to get a wider variety of voices. And so what this did was it did surface new narratives. It revealed pockets of poverty. Was among pensioners was one case. The high prices of rent was another that had really not been acknowledged before. And it revealed racial inequalities. And these new narratives actually contributed to what we call incremental systemic change. So the reason why I was sort of wanted to present this, it's really in line with what Christian was talking about as the sort of the way that transformation happens through changes in the socio-technical system sort of gradually. We were trying to think about how does change come about, and we came about with this sort of incremental systemic change. So by working closely with the politicians and civil servants, the Falkland Islands government sort of was able to digest these new narratives about racial inequalities and started to, it brought up again this race relations ordinance, a piece of legislation that had been sort of floated, and then it just apparent in 1994 hadn't been addressed for 30 years. It seemed too difficult to address, but they kind of brought this back into discussion and had started work on that. And they also started addressing income inequalities as well. So my point here, I wanted to kind of get across like our idea of, the context that we're working is this kind of incremental systemic change is the way we started to think about how does engaged research contribute to transformation. And in a way, our lessons are, first of all, what we did was nothing super spectacular, but it wasn't rocket science, but it was a lot of work of enrolling different groups in that, building relationships, and getting lots of different groups involved. So it takes a lot of hard work, commitment, and social sensitivity. So I'll speak a little bit more about this. Thinking about then engaged methods, that's, as I said, methods that have potential to produce change where the researcher is involved in the very process that they're researching. So I think we can think about methods, these kind of methods on a spectrum. At one end, we have maybe traditional methods, which we can think about in a more collaborative way. And at the other end, we have sort of transformative methods that are intrinsically devoted to bringing about changes. So what I'm trying to say here is that when thinking about engaged methods, it's not only at the end of action research where the goal is to produce a change in practice. It can also, we can think about using about working in an engaged way, also with traditional methods such as survey research or interviews, if we think about them dialogically. In the survey research case, it would be about perhaps we implement this in a kind of collaborative, sort of under a collaborative umbrella. Then participant observation would be the kind of in the middle, a traditional qualitative research method that involves the researcher being involved in the society that they're studying. And then participatory research being more to the transformative end. So my point is, like, there's a whole kind of spectrum here. All of these can be done in an engaged and collaborative way. And it's about kind of obviously fitting the method to the our research purposes. And we can think about these challenges of engaged methods at all levels of this spectrum, right? They can come in, even if we're designing survey research in collaboration with some practitioners or policymakers, as well as being relevant at the action research sort of end. So I think one of the things that's quite useful to think about the researcher's role in participant observation, this is kind of very well established in ethnographic research, but we can use it to think about this whole spectrum of engaged research as well. So sort of traditionally, participant observation is a method where people embed themselves in communities, try to become participants, as well as taking the observational point of view. And the whole crux of that method has sometimes said is between being a Martian, like so somebody from Mars looking down with complete sort of unfamiliarity and critical distance, and a convert, like the convert to a religion who completely understands it from the inside. So one can have a role somewhere on this spectrum from complete observer to complete participant, but what we often aim for is something in the middle, a participant observer. And again, there's this whole spectrum. It's all fine, and they're all appropriate, and they can be used in different contexts. So quite often we might have these ones in the middle. You might be something more of an observer because you don't have the opportunity to participate. So you might be a participating observer, or you might be very close to that society and be more of an observing participant. So it's kind of thinking about that whole spectrum, placing ourselves on the spectrum, and kind of the kind of crux of the matter is, I think, to do with to what degree we participate and to what degree we observe, and that what we want to get is both the critical distance and the understanding from the insider point of view, and whichever end of the spectrum we are on, the other one is going to be a challenge. So it's about trying to create opportunities for all of both of those types of knowledge to emerge. Another aspect of engaged research is that it's often not linear, or it's often depicted in participatory action research cycles, for example, where if you're trying to do research that involves bringing about changes, it's not that variable based, input output type of model, but it's much more cyclical. So we often, we define a problem, we try out an action, make observations, reflect on how that worked. It leads us to redefine the problem, redesign the action, and we get this kind of cyclical process. Now, this nonlinear character of engaged research, I think, can be very destabilizing, right? So it can feel like, where is the beginning? Where is the end? When have I done enough? How do I tell the story? And so how do we go about this? And I think one of the important things is setting up a good process. If we set up a good process, then people can feel they are allowed to trust that process to bring something about. Because these kind of engaged methods, they're often open-ended. You don't know for sure where they're going to end up. They can be quite creative, and so you need to be able to trust the process and the uncertainties. And so that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about how do we set up a good process? And through these two areas, the social infrastructures for collaboration, and then a little bit about methods. And I think maybe I'll have to kind of speed up a little bit to get to cover them. But my first point here is that research methodology often seems to neglect the social context of a piece of research, the relationships that are necessary to, before we even get to case selection or sample selection, or designing our instruments and so on. There's so much contextual work about networks, gatekeepers, relationships, the resources we have available, the power relations allowing us to have access to some places rather than others, the time that's available, who is willing to collaborate, and so on. And so, especially I think if we're thinking about research, engaged research that wants to make changes itself, collaborations are really, really crucial. And this is really sort of well established, I think, in the whole literature on evidence-based policy, and the literature on dissemination is moving a lot more towards collaborations, co-production, and so on, as ways of making research matter for practice and for policy. So basically, as I said before, it's kind of not rocket science. There are principles for good collaboration, which are sort of quite well known, I think, in this field, but they often turn out to be very hard to implement. So just sort of some of those kinds of principles are about establishing clarity about roles, expectations, and goals, good communication, recognition and mutual respect, trust, boundary spanning leadership. So these are all kind of relational matters about setting up collaborative relations. And my main point is that I think this stage is really often neglected, and it deserves a lot of attention and work. In our work in the Falkland Islands, it really depended on that. So that's an important area, I think, to think about and commit time and resources to. I'm going to skip my next example to move on to my last section, which is about methodological responses to challenges of researcher involvement. So this is something that we kind of, I work in a department of methodology, teaching qualitative methods. And people are often concerned about, well, how do I establish that my research is good research if it's not reliable, valid, generalizable in the ways that we've learned with the kind of objectivist paradigm. And so my colleagues have George Gaskell and Martin Bauer worked on this, and they came up with a different way of thinking about good quality methodology, which we've sort of developed a bit into a series of practices and goals that qualitative researchers might aspire to as a way of ensuring the quality of their research. So I'll just rattle through a few of these and let's see if they resonate with people. So the first one is about transparency. So here, this is sort of a parallel or an alternative to the more objectivist approach to reliability. So instead of thinking about, can this study be replicated, it's more about, can the reader understand how I came to produce the findings I did? So, taking, again, as I said before, it's about ownership over the positionality. It's not that this is generalizable, that everybody would have discovered the same thing, but with the resources and opportunities that I had, the intellectual assumptions, etc., the social context that we were in, can I make that transparent enough so the reader can understand, oh, I see how they got there. And another approach is about diversity of sources. So again, this is to do with that, again, perspectivism and positionality. Have we got enough diversity of sources so that we're not simply entrenching, all the assumptions and approaches that we began with? And this leads us to the concept of reflexivity, so that if researcher positionality matters, reflexivity is a practice of accounting for the researcher's positioning. So it's, not just making it transparent, but then reflecting on, what are my social positions? How did that produce the kinds of, shape the kinds of interpretations and claims and actions and results that I was capable of producing and that other people might do differently. We're nearly there. Another idea is about showing the empirical grounding and openness to alternatives. So, engaged researchers, this is about that being in that participant observation role. Engaged researchers are, sort of become committed to certain kinds of outcomes, build relationships with the collaborators who they're working with? Do they manage to get critical distance? And so, so empirical grounding means about kind of making quite explicit, some of our data and how we build our interpretations, considering counter evidence and exceptions, and demonstrating surprise. So if we got challenged, if our expectations were challenged at some point, if we came to new insights we hadn't anticipated, if something was a surprise, this is a good sign and worth reflecting on and building in. There's two more of these: transferability and significance. So this is sort of the so what question. This is, I guess, a kind of an analog to the principle of generalizability. Qualitative researchers often talk about transferability. Could my knowledge transfer to other cases? And Christian referred to this challenge, I think, earlier in the problem of in-depth case studies, case-based research. And so here we kind of think about transferability in two ways. One is in terms of empirical transferability. So my case is a case of something that happens in other locations as well, and I make the case that it's has parallels empirically. Or theoretical transferability. So by engaging with theories that other members of our epistemic community use, we help to develop those theories which transfer at a more abstract level. And then last of all, about the pragmatic significance. Again, so this is like the so what question. We can ask, does it work, and does it work to do what? So for engaged research, the outcomes of transformative knowledge processes could be somewhat intangible. They could be very tangible. So we might produce some actionable new insights. We might generate new conversations. We could produce developments in practice, learnings about processes, and or academic substantive findings. And I think sometimes there's a bit of a tension between producing useful knowledge for practice in a particular location and producing substantive academic contributions. But that's something maybe interesting to discuss later. So I just want to leave you lastly with some questions for reflection. So in doing this kind of work, these are some questions that might be useful to ask ourselves. Which stakeholders' perspectives are represented in our research design and which are excluded? How do we design our collaborative processes for inclusion? So I really want to emphasize that if we want to make changes, we probably want to collaborate, and it's a lot of work. It needs a lot of attention itself, that whole process. We can think about where we situate ourselves on that spectrum of researcher involvement. And in relation to this objectivism versus sort of pragmatism, theoretical epistemological approach, we might ask ourselves, are there institutional barriers to engaged or collaborative research? So for example, if objectivism has more of a dominance in the academic context, are PhD regulations or promotions criteria, funding structures and timeframes more suited to other kinds of research? And are there workarounds that we can do to make more collaborative work feasible? We could ask ourselves, where do we expect transformation to come from? And the big question, how do we retain critical distance while engaging collaboratively? Okay, that's it there.
All right, thank you, Flora. A little bit over time. I still take out the time to bring up, this always confuses me. I draw together some of the questions that we do have in the chat, and then some of it would have to be referred to for later. I'm afraid, Hugues, I do pick you up this time. Does this pragmatic approach kind of naturally induce a regional case-based research approach? Then I think also generally interesting, how does this actually relate to action research? And also, how does it relate to critical rationalism? Of course, Karl Popper's work.
Okay.
I think
So
the
first
bias
of all,
question, sorry, Michael, the bias question, I think was answered late in the talk. And
okay.
Christian, maybe I have to refer you this time.
So does a pragmatic approach, I think a pragmatic approach is very, very suited to a case-based research. And on my slides, I referred to a book by Pflitsch, Making Social Science Matter. And so he does case studies of kind of big policy municipalities making big sort of changes and so on. And I think that work is really, really suited. So I think a pragmatic approach, yeah, is a great fit with sort of case-based work. How does it relate to action research? Action research is a, what is action research? It's an approach particularly used in kind of in professional fields or in community-based work, where ostensibly the primary purpose is to produce improvements in practices, like healthcare workers, you know, are going to do a piece of research to figure out like what is impeding them doing better, you know, giving better care, reflect on that and improve their practices, or working with communities to figure out what is stopping them from achieving their goals. And I think the main thing with action research is that the goal is to produce changes in practice, right? Not necessarily to produce kind of academic knowledge. I think so, and that can be I think that can be a challenge for academic researchers. So in our case, and to be honest, in our case, with the work that we did in the Falkland Islands, I guess it was a kind of action research. We didn't kind of frame it in that way, and we found it a little tricky because of this kind of cyclical approach when we were writing it up. And thinking about it in the way that the UK sort of knowledge infrastructure still does think quite a lot about the idea that research comes first, and then from doing your clever research, you derive implications for practice, and then you sort of, you know, you go like based on the kind of medical model from bench to bedside, you know, they still have a little bit of this approach. And so in kind of writing up that paper, it wasn't that we did a piece of brilliant academic research first and then it had an implication. It was that we, from the beginning, aimed to make changes. And so that our research article, that's why our research article was in a way trying to theorize how do we think about the kind of changes that academic emergency planner collaborations can make. And we came up with the idea of incremental systemic change. And it was kind of showing the methodology of what we did. So anyway, so that's kind of like, maybe it was a piece of action research, and I was trying to illustrate the sort of the tensions that it makes and the way it has to make you think a bit differently about research, change, how they link together.
Right, Flora, I think I'm gonna have to stop you there, and we have to potentially the critical rationalism question, we might have to refer to later more detailed discussions. Thank you, all three of you, for, I think, very, very nice and complimentary talks. I thought that was immensely impressive, how it was this kind of range of qualitative approaches that we saw today. So that was really, really interesting. So at this point, I would just like to say there's more free CREST sessions scheduled later this year. I myself am back in October with a very interesting session on path into relations. There's also another CREST TRAKR collaboration coming up next month. This is more focused on quantitative approaches to transformative knowledge that will take place on the 21st of March. It will feature my colleague Sebastian Losak, as well as Tasha Bartoli and Nika Murek. And my colleague Maria Zuri from CREST will be chairing this session. More information and an opportunity to register for free can be found on the RSA website, as always. The website also includes information on memberships of the RSA, membership bands that the RSA consider both career stage and geography. At this point, it remains for me to say thank you to our speakers for, as I said, really, really wonderful and inspiring talks. Thank you very much to the RSA organizers, especially Nicola and Alex, who are probably getting nervous at this point because of our time running over time a little bit, but for your very, very kind assistance throughout today and in general organizing these webinars. And then, of course, you, the participants, the attendees, for asking these wonderful and engaging, interesting questions. So at this point, we now have a short break before we meet again. I will do something that I hope doesn't make everyone very nervous, but I basically moved the time schedule by 5 minutes, and I'd say we reconvene at 45 to enter the workshop with our TRAKR colleagues. At this point, Hugues Jeannerat will take over the chair from myself for this part. And with that, it remains for me to say thank you, everyone, and bye for now.
So I hope you had time to discuss. We were cut in the middle of our discussion, but fortunately, we can continue together to develop our thoughts. First, in order to start this plenary, I will give the words to my colleagues who will synthesize with some words what has been said in their own room. Maybe I give you the word first to Anna with Gesa.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. We had a very intensive discussion and connected to many different points. I will just shortly go through them to let you know and inform you about what we talked about. It was, for example, about like deconstructing the process topologies, also depending on the type of interview partners you've had. So really to compare whether you have different views on the process and how it evolved depending on the type of actors you interviewed, and then compare according to the maps and how far they are similar or different. So this was one approach or one point in the discussion we've had. And then we discuss also in how far it is possible to really grasp transformative knowledge with the process topology approach. And here Gesa suggested that you can really grasp and analyze in how far cumulative knowledge maybe emerged in the first place, and how it evolved into more very combinatorial and transformative knowledge dynamics over time. The example was, for example, how citizen associations changed their actions over time as part of this transformative process. For example, they distributed flyer, let's say in the early 80s, and now they do something like urban gardening projects so that their actions really become much more transformative compared to earlier times. And maybe as the last point, we also discussed how to operationalize the transition topology, for example, in how far the relations Gesa talked about were defined beforehand or as a result of the research process. But in fact, this depends on the theoretical framing and how you use the method in your own research. That's for now from my side. Thank you very much.
I think you are mute, Hugues.
Yeah, I wanted to give you the word, Luis, actually.
Thank you. I thought so. That's why I intervened. Well, in our room, well, Christian was very kind to give us an in-depth exploration about how does the method actually works. He gave us a very nice new example that he had mentioned before in the talk, but now it's some more details and the specificities about how to go to field work. So we discussed a lot protocol and the data sets, which kind of issues we can do, and which kind of issues we are supposed to face in this kind of method. So I'd say that we had a more methodological session to a very large extent, but I think it was a useful thing to do. Then we discussed a bit also outlook of the method. Where is the method going? If you see other people using that or not, like. We had a discussion about about the bidirectionality of links within the network. So which kind of new avenues we could explore to improve some characteristics of the method. Of course, it comes with additional complexities. So we discussed that a bit. And then when we were pulled out of our breakout room, we were starting to discuss the link between the method itself and transformative knowledge, like the extent to which this method can measure or assess what transformative knowledge actually is. So we were starting to go into these more conceptual discussions. So we didn't finish it yet. Well, Christian gave us some good ideas about it, but I think we can eventually take it forward now in the plenary discussion. And I think it was it from our side. Again, we took a more methodological perspective because we felt that there is need to go a bit more in depth and understand what the method actually implies. So thank you very much for that, Christian and the group.
Thank you, Luis. And Kerstin, what about your group?
Yeah, we went also more into detail in action research and differentiating to participatory action research. What's the difference in getting getting others to do their own action research plans, for example, according to participatory action research. And we were talking about how can we evaluate action research and what is the scientific impact maybe, or maybe it's about impact, which we should measure more to evaluate action research. But there's also this tension in between the real action and impact, the local impact on a local level. And on the other hand, we have to write scientific papers, and maybe the scientific papers won't be read, and if we write, for example, a blog article or a newspaper article, then we have a huge range of people who will get to know our research, and so we have even higher impact. So there's this tension in between. We are as researchers doing action research as well, and I think this were the main topics we were discussing so far.
Okay, thank you. I don't think I have all the synthesis in mind, but what I propose now for the last 20 minutes, I think, is to come up with some basic topic. I will try to put into discussion also 2 or 3 keynotes at the same time. It won't be possible to put the 3 of them every time together. But I really think that we have a basic question to develop further, and it was also what you proposed to follow up, Luis, is the question of knowledge, especially in the 2 presentations of Gesa and Christian, and what is actually the matter of transformative knowledge in your nice analysis, because you have configurations, you have organizations, you have institutions, but what is actually knowledge about in this configuration? Is it about making the link? Is it about building the institutions, changing the institutions? Yeah, so that would be for me the first angle for the debate.
Can I start?
Yeah.
Because that just follows up on where we stopped with our group in the discussion. So the way I understood it, or I tried to frame it in my presentation, is that the transformative knowledge is really knowledge about how to transform these entrenched systems, or how to change institutionalization of existing, take it for granted solutions and institutionalize the new ones. So it's about really, institutionalization and deinstitutionalization, and then knowing how you can go about this. And this has a lot to do with institutional work and having a full system perspective and having a sort of a grasp of what's happening in practice in a very deep way. So the way I would frame what this STCA method can do is that it can give new forms of systems and target knowledge. So we have a new way of analyzing the systems and where they stand. And we can understand, the sort of desired future states as they are represented through the actors. So with this study we did in the value position of the actors in this new water field in Switzerland, through the actors sort of, statements, you could see, okay, what are the different desired future states and how close together are they, how far are they? And then you can transform this type of target or system knowledge into then concrete intervention. So how could we go about bringing them together, creating a hybrid logic that combines it all, creating a coherent strategy for transformation in the future instead of having 3 different camps running in different directions. So that's how I would frame what this method can do. But I'm really looking forward to the others' reflections.
If I understand correctly, the value of your methods is more about the knowledge your schemes generate. Actually, it's more about your knowledge or the knowledge you produce with this analysis that has a transformative value, but it's not about the knowledge that is involved in the system. For me, it's there are the 2 big issues discussed today. That's why I think it's interesting.
It's a deeper way to understand the knowledge that's in the system, which you can use to be more transformative with interventions, something like that.
Okay, but that means that's the knowledge that you generate.
Yeah, in a way.
About the systemic mapping. Okay, what about you, Gesa? What do you think?
Yeah, I think Christian already described it quite well. I mean, for me, it's always a bit, today I have to differentiate a bit between, because I only use the transition topology as an example for process-based visual methods in general. So I think then there are 2 possibilities. I mean, one is, as Anna already said, that we use a process-based visual approach like the innovation biographies, and maybe try to, at the moment, it tries to map the spatiality of knowledge. But we could maybe also try to map more complex dynamics underlying these processes, what you have done through textual coding so far, also in such a kind of map, and analyze these underlying processes in more detail. That would require that you have to turn them into activities, or you have to be able to identify activities and events, basically. That's one approach that you could take if you want to stay in this institutional framework, which I think also makes a lot of sense. Then for me, what I try to illustrate a bit with the Augsburg example is that for me, it's really important how this institutional organizational context in a region really enables this generation of transformative knowledge, I think. And since this knowledge is so dispersed across actors and thematic fields in a region, I think you really need to build up such a context as in Augsburg in order to facilitate this transformative knowledge generation. And this process-based thinking, I think especially this strong process ontology, what this enables is, or shows us, is that this context always has to change itself, because also what we now define as transformative knowledge will change. So it's, for me, an ongoing change process. And that is something that you have seen in Augsburg quite well. Anna mentioned it already at the beginning. What the local agenda did was mainly disseminating knowledge through flyers. And this has fundamentally changed over time. Now they are trying to change everyday practices of actors by plastic fasting together or something, or urban gardening together. So I think that's also a very different kind of generating transformative knowledge. And for this, also this context had to change in order to facilitate these processes, because I think there's a lot of sense making underlying these processes, and that is enabled through such temporary events as the local agenda forums in Augsburg. Yeah, I stop here.
Thank you. Thank you. The floor is also for the whole audience, and please just raise your hand if you want to intervene. But if nobody for the moment would like to intervene, I would really then join Flora into the discussion, because what we discussed also in Flora's group with Kerstin, I was in, is actually it fits nicely with what you previously said, Christian. Actually, the idea was also that the scientific value we have, because we have this big stretch between, on the one hand, action research that is evaluated about what it brings to the society and its outcome. And on the other hand, the publication that we may or may not build upon this action research. What is the value of our publication or scientific knowledge for action research or transformation was actually this question of scale. Is actually it was an an insight from Flora to say, yeah, the value of our scientific knowledge is actually to upscale what we observe at a very small and particular level, and that actually, and maybe you might correct me if I misunderstood what you meant, but actually is that our own knowledge could be on transformation about changing the institutions by, on the one hand, analyzing the configuration, the topologies, or whatever, make it explicit at a upper scale level, on an abstract, more theoretical level. And then, of course, what is missing, and it could be also a discussion for us, is that when it's explicit, how do we manage change? And it was also related to your question you had to Flora, Christian, in the first round. It was, should we involve with policymaking much more in order to value this scaling knowledge or scalable knowledge or something like this? So yeah, it's a very open question. What do you think, Flora, in this debate?
I think you articulated what I was trying to say, very well. And I think in our discussion also I said, like, one of the ways that I think about that moving scale is through thinking about the very concrete work as in terms of case studies, with the kind of methodological challenge of case studies being to generalize, by asking, like, what is this a case of? And it's a case of some process or kind of, concept that we can link towards. And so, like, that's one way that I think about it, with that kind of that case study logic, and asking what is this a case of, to move to that more abstract level. So I think that's what that is what I have to say. But Christian might have another angle.
Jesper, are you inspired?
Very much inspired. Yes, I have a suggestion about, I think it's important to distinguish different, what is transformative knowledge? What does it help transforming? And I think it's important to distinguish between different levels of or orders of change, that you actually also, you can have a very individual technological first order change, where you simply do things better. You can have a second order change, and thereby learning and knowledge contribution, where you develop systems a little, Christian's socio-technological configurations. But then you can also have a third order change, or learning and knowledge, where you change the whole paradigm, where you see different on the world. I think it's somehow it's maybe difficult to operationalize, but it is a little important, I think, to distinguish and also be aware that transformation take place at not only the system level, the landscape level, to use this multi-level perspective, but it takes place in different scales.
Yeah, Christian, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I would like to come back to Flora's point, and also this idea about scaling. I really like that. So first of all, about my question before. So I really struggle with this, my own positionality often. So I also agree, pure research is boring. but I also don't want to be recognized as a pure activist in my field. So I want to stand somewhere in between, and that's really hard to tip the balance. So what I now realize in a big project we're running in one city in India, which is very inter and transdisciplinary, is that it's really nice to be like the scientist still, but work very closely with a local intermediary who's then really well connected with everything that's going on in practice and constantly translating between what they learn from the ground with our work, and we adapt our research questions, what we learn, and feed it back, and that can be very productive. So you're still a scientist, but you're very much involved and you know about what's going on in the ground, and you have very trustful relationships. That could be a model which, at least in this one project, sort of works well. And so then the second thing is about scaling. So I really think that that's true as a researcher. We maybe have a really important role to play in scaling these ideas that really work well in one place to other places, maybe also to other scales, to actors at different scales, because it's not like the diffusion that you usually see with normal technologies that just diffuse through markets. So if you have these transformative socio-technical configurations, they move from one place to the next, they get translated, maybe aggregated a bit in the process, and gradually create a new sort of paradigm for the system. And so in this translation between scales and places, researchers can play a key role because we often have these connections. And so in this case with India, I can now actually connect them to global players, invite them to events here in Switzerland, showcase that something really interesting is developing in that place that has global relevance. And that's something we can certainly do quite well as researchers. We're well positioned to do that. Yeah, these are two reflections, I guess.
Camilla?
Yeah, I'm kind of almost saying the same thing as Christian. So sorry, Christian, for doing the thing where I repeat what you said in different words. But I think the power of the science, or at least to me, the understanding of theory, and also how I try to explain it to students, is that having this ability to abstract from the very specific, that then makes knowledge travel. Right, so you can go from your case study in India, and you kind of, if you have this ability to look at the mechanisms that are hidden within what is happening, you kind of get out of the very, very, very place-specific aspects. Because then, as you say, you can bring together an Indian actor and maybe a Central European actor, and the Central European actor won't say, but this is India, this is India, this is not relevant to me. But you can kind of say, yeah, but the dynamics, because it's humans involved, by the way, in some ways, they are very similar. So, and I think that is the beauty of theory, to me, but as I said, it's kind of the same thing that you just said, but I think that is the power of theory, and you're making knowledge and transformative knowledge indeed travel.
Could I just say something quickly back to Christian, which is, I think, the kind of, I think, in a way, what you were describing is sort of maybe a little bit what I was trying to get at with the idea of social infrastructures for collaborative research, like those big collaborative projects with multi-disciplines, multi-countries, maybe people in different positions, from activists to community member scientist. Like, they're really difficult to make them work very well, I think, but they're incredibly productive. Like, I think that is a way to produce transformative knowledge, because you're bringing together all these different positionalities and perspectives, and it, in the clash you get something new. And so I think, that in a way what you're doing, if I could say, is it's kind of also changing science. Like, you're in this kind of action research, and it's, you're not doing action research exactly, or maybe you are, but you're instantiating a different model of doing science, which is collaborative, engages with activists. Not everybody has to be a scholar activist. There's different ways of, on that whole spectrum of scholar versus activism. But I think that's a fantastic example of kind of institutionalizing a different model of science that is more engaged with making changes in the world at the same time as developing sort of, clever scientific insights.
Gesa, do you have additional thoughts?
Yes, I try to be short. I just wanted to add on to this, also what Camilla said, and because I found it quite interesting that we all mentioned this, that we have to change the way we approach our research kind of, I think Christian even said we have to have some paradigmatic change. And that was also something that you kind of triggered me to think about, was asking me to present the topology again, because I didn't really want to just present this approach. I rather wanted to present to you or reflect with you on why I developed this approach. And I think it's because we are kind of unsatisfied with this existing theories that often already point us in a certain direction. And I think with the topology, I mean, I don't, for example, engage so closely with with the stakeholders, but I also engage quite closely with them, and I go back with the topology to them and reflect together with them on the topologies that I draw. So it's also for me a boundary object, kind of, an important communicative tool, but one that doesn't really, kind of, it's still also very connected to the empirical data, and I can really show where it comes from. I can make very transparent how I come to certain conclusions. And this also means I can better reflect on this process with the stakeholders. I think that is for me also something important that I haven't really said in my presentation, but also now where Flora's, the criteria you presented, which were important for making good qualitative research, I think that's also something that I can really, or I tried at least to do with the topology.
I think it is really interesting, and if I may also some words to the very final debate I would like to start. I think we have in this in this webinar two dimensions of knowledge. First, what kind of knowledge do we observe? And as an external researcher, which was more about the first two presentations of Christian and Gesa, and you spoke about configuration or topologies and with these ideas of institutions. So I think there is still a field or further conception to understand what kind of knowledge is in there. And maybe a provocative question would be, are the traditional categories useful as we knew in the previous era of knowledge economies, such as symbolic, synthetic, analytical, synthetic, and so on and so forth, tacit, codified, or whatever, all these categories, are they still useful to explain about learning that are at stake in valuation, for instance, in institutionalization, for instance? And I think I have the feeling they are not, or they are not enough. And where should we go with knowledge categories, types, to observe, to in some way to explain what is the blood of your networks you drew, both. That's for me the question. And the second question, which is actually related, but is more about our own transformative knowledge. And our own transformative knowledge as researcher, and of course the research we will do on transformative knowledge as an outcome, but which is part of our scientific knowledge we will produce in this era. And when I heard you, Flora, Christian, and the more I think about it, we could say on the floor we observe tacit knowledge, but it's very schematic because it doesn't fit. It is not a good wording. But actually, could we say that our case studies are the tacit knowledge we observe at some point, and our scientific knowledge is some kind of codified knowledge that we can upscale. But I'm very unsatisfied with this because it is not about diffusing. And we had before this idea of what is scalable is codified knowledge because it's replicable. We are able to codify technologies that in order that they are getting mobile. But it's very important what you stressed, Christian, is that actually our theoretical framework is not about making a very single case copy-pastable somewhere else. It's about interpreting some kind of essence that is not upscaled but rescaled, to use your wording also, somewhere else. And for me, what would be the concept to use for this kind of knowledge, which is actually scientific, the science and the scale? And maybe we could find something similar in other activities, not only in science, but this knowledge about scalability that is not codifying, but translating, but it's not, yeah. Okay, so I stop here and I will leave the floor until...
I wanted to propose translational knowledge.
Okay.
So that's a good...
Okay, one proposition. Flora? You are muted.
Yeah. When I talked about the case study, I talked about this work by Bent Flubier, who is a Danish organizational research management type of researcher. He talks about, I think he talks about tacit knowledge as the kind of foundation of case studies. But I agree, when you were describing it there, I'm not quite satisfied with this tacit versus codified, and then the codified is more abstract. And I was reflecting on, you know, what in his books, he tries to put forward this idea of phronesis, or I don't know if anybody is familiar with this work at all. But yes, okay. So, which is like, is apparently one of Aristotle's kinds of knowledge that are based in the practical. And he makes this connection. He talks about the expertise. He talks about like what you learn from multiple case studies is a form of embodied fluid expertise, like a surgeon or a football player, a good social scientist, through exposing themselves to multiple case studies and reading others, that they get this fluid expertise, which is a kind of, it's not like an abstract theory knowledge, but it's a sort of sensitivity to how different kinds of contextual configurations plus humans with their power dynamics and their identities and values, you know, plus symbolic commitments, and you get this kind of expertise in how things are going to pan out. And so it kind of keeps the concrete with the more general. But anyway, so it's like phronesis is my proposition here.
Okay, could you maybe also, before the end of this workshop, maybe just send us in the chat the reference of the author, just the name, or yeah, it would be great. So is there any other, I see the time is running, are my colleagues from TRAKR or from CREST or whoever would like to have a final word, because I'm done. Additional word regarding this webinar? If it's not the case, I will recall you that it's still a work in progress. And unfortunately, we are in a research network that is alive and live. And I will propose to Jesper to take some word about the next Bornholm meeting in order to advertise the very nice destination he's proposing to us. And then I will conclude with the very final word.
Yes, thank you, Hugues. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the next event in the row of TRAK network activities is on Bornholm, and it's taking place October 3 and 4 this year. And we have a title for this, which is just called Transformative Knowledge Cases. And the point, at least from the beginning, was after these more conceptual and methodological discussions, maybe to have a little more empirical evidence, some case studies. Again, here focused on what we just ended with here. What is actually, how to understand transformative knowledge, different types, and what is the role for regional sustainability transitions. A second goal that, of course, relates very much to the first is to discuss possible papers for a special issue that the TRAK network maybe will try to organize. Yeah, then a third point, which of course is not planned yet, but it is somehow a visit to the what is here called Energy Island Bornholm project, or to invite some of the people involved in this coming and talk about it. I can tell, which is clear from the map here in the right upper left corner, that Bornholm is an island in the Baltic Sea, and it's not only from the many years a big tourist destination for Danes and for Germans, and also growingly for the other Nordic countries and for Poland. But it's also in the middle of very ambitious strategic plans for building new energy technologies and infrastructures. And one of the big parts of this prospect is the Danish government's ideas about building the first in the world, the so-called energy island. It's a giant sea wind farm just very close to Bornholm, and the electricity and there will be some facilities on land in which you also will have the possibility of rather scale power to X production. And this, of course, Bornholm is located in the middle of all these Polish, Swedish, Danish, German wind building construction of these infrastructures. So Bornholm is located in the middle, so it has a position maybe to gain the harbor in Bornholm will maybe be the center of these construction and maintenance of these systems. Beside of that, it will follow a lot of opportunities for economic, social, cultural development on Bornholm, which is very interesting as a case study for sustainable transition. From coming to an island, it is of course a little more demanding, both in time and in costs. It's not extreme extra additional cost, but of course there is an extra link of coming to Bornholm. There are flights, direct flights from Copenhagen Airport to Bornholm. It's also a ferry connection where you take a bus also from the airport or from Central Station in Copenhagen. It takes 3 hours. It goes through the south of Sweden. And there is a ferry to Bornholm, and it takes about 3 hours. It will be hosted by my research center, which is called Center for Regional and Tourism Research. It's a small independent research center located here on Bornholm. We existed since the 90s and was started as part of a regional development plan for Bornholm because of the fishery was very big on Bornholm. It collapsed in the beginning of the 90s, so there was a need to start something new. We have a small satellite office in Copenhagen, where it's more data and modeling, economic modeling that they work with. Here in Bornholm, my colleagues, and we are not many, we are only 8 persons here in Bornholm, and more or less the similar in Copenhagen. Anyway, we will do our very best to welcome everybody that would like to take part in this, and we really hope that a lot of people will come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jesper. Thank you also very much to everybody for taking part to this event. If I just can add some advertisement about Bornholm. Bornholm is a very familiar island, and also the center where Jesper work is also very familiar and friendly. I think it's quite of kind of DNA of our research network. We would really like to support this atmosphere. I think also in this webinar, although we were quite distant from each other, the atmosphere was also very nice, and I also found very promising and exciting all the discussion. I look forward to the next webinar. I see here Sebastian Lozacker, which will be one of the keynotes with Nika and Tasha, our colleagues from Ljubljana. So please do not hesitate to register for this next webinar, which will be on the 21st. Thanks again also for the very friendly contribution of Flora, Gesa, and Christian. It's really a pleasure to have them in this network. Join us whenever you want in the future. And thanks again to the young researcher. We were quite a lot of young researcher. That's quite nice to explore further what we call transformative knowledge, which is still a boundary object that still need to be clarified and developed together. So I'm done. I really thank you again, and I wish you a very nice day again and end of the week. And bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.